Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Vergote, and my capstone is about the effects of tourism stress on birds. When Dr. Burks had us focus on stress, I wanted to connect stress with some of the things I do in my daily life. I love spending time outdoors. I enjoy many ecotourism activities, such as hiking, snorkeling, and birdwatching. I'm not alone in my passion for nature. Many people enjoy spending time outdoors, especially now with the COVID-19 restrictions. And this thought made me wonder that if more and more people are spending the time outdoors, what effect is it having on the animals around us? This question began my investigation into ecotourism stress. I could not evaluate the effects of ecotourism on all species. However, I needed to narrow my question and quickly found my focus on birds. Having found both my stress and my target group of species, I needed to develop a manner of evaluating of the stress effects. So I developed my first question, a simple yet important one. Does ecotourism stress birds? And if yes, how can this stress be measured or quantified? By quantifying stress within birds, it allowed me to determine what effects does ecotourism stress have on individuals within a species. The study and data from different species allows for the ability to check for what trends are observed across the family Aves. Common trends can be analyzed and used to make changes to the conservation practices. The informed changes to conservation practices ultimately leads to managing the initial problem of ecotourism stressing birds. Now, I'd like to run through the stress framework. Stress is experienced across multiple biological scales and must be factored into account when discussed. Stressors are activities or things that induce stress in homeostasis and allostasis in targets. Targets can range greatly depending on biological scale from cells to ecosystems. Targets respond to stressors by changing their function, structure, or behavior. Now, responses can induce manifestations in hormones, behaviors, or environments. Management of different manifestations includes evaluating the severity of an individual problem, understanding the complex interactions involved, and making a plan to alleviate the stressor. This leads me to my stress framework with ecotourism and birds. Our stressor is chronic ecotourism, which is considered to be consistent outdoor human activity year round. And it induces stress in different birds species within our target. Birds respond to this stress by changes in their function and behavior. Specifically, a common behavior associated with stress is nest abandonment behavior, which can affect populations. The responses manifest themselves as increases in stress hormone corticosterone. Elevated corticosterone concentrations can lead to changes in bird responses over time. Additionally, long-term elevated corticosterone concentrations can also affect larger targets than individuals as breeding females affect populations. This is why there is a need to better understand the effects of ecotourism on birds, because an important conservation plan is necessary in order to alleviate the pressures of ecotourism on birds. So the main question is, to what extent does chronic ecotourism stress affect the fitness of individuals in the class Aves? In order to answer this question, I first needed to know if corticosterone concentrations increase across different bird species due to ecotourism stress, and if behavioral and functional responses correlated with changes to corticosterone concentrations. Recent studies have already identified negative responses correlated to ecotourism in both reptiles and mammals. Marine iguanas have seen a decrease in immunological functions in the presence of chronic human tourism, as well as pandas have seen decreased reproductive success in the presence of chronic ecotourism. Now, the literature search resulted in identification of my three main words: corticosterone, ecotourism, and birds. Each of the sources located were peer-reviewed and from scientific journals. About 53 relevant results were collected from this search. 23% of the results were redundancies, leaving us with only about 41 sources useful to this review. 88% of these results were of empirical studies, and the remaining 12% constituted of review papers. The literature reviewed helped to develop my small testable questions. First, Are corticosteroid concentrations after tourism different from baseline levels? So I hypothesize that corticosteroid concentrations after tourism will be greater than before tourism. This assumption is simple, but develops the foundation for the following questions. Second, is the nest abandonment behavior correlated with increased corticosteroid concentrations? I hypothesized that nest abandonment behavior would increase with elevated corticosteroid concentrations. This determines if nest abandonment behavior can be evaluated based off corticosteroid concentrations alone. And lastly, are baseline corticosteroid concentrations and post-tourism corticosteroid concentrations correlated? I hypothesized that a positive correlation would exist between baseline corticosteroid concentrations and corticosteroid concentration post-tourism. Now, the results. My t-test results found that the corticosteroid concentrations after tourism are greater than before tourism. This is expected as tourism induces stress in birds and birds produce ecotourism when stressed. However, nest abandonment behavior does not increase with elevated corticosteroid concentrations. The box plot graph shows a trend that agrees with this hypothesis, however, was not found to be statistically distinct. This result is due to large deviations between diverse bird species. The correlation test found that corticosteroid concentrations after tourism are positively correlated with corticosteroid concentrations before tourism, or the baseline corticosteroid concentrations. This result dictates that diverse bird species corticosteroid concentrations after tourism increase as baseline cort levels do, as well as that changes in corticosteroid concentrations deviate between diverse species as well. So birds experience stress from ecotourism and it manifests as elevated corticosteroid concentrations. The effect of chronic ecotourism resulting in changes to baseline corticosteroid concentrations remains unknown. Future research will need to identify if chronic ecotourism stress can result in changes to baseline levels of stress hormones in birds. Future research can utilize changes in corticosteroid concentrations for correlation with other behavioral and functional responses other than nest abandonment behavior. A limitation of this study is the view of large taxonomy for data collection. Future studies should focus on common trends between more closely related bird species than in this review. At our current level of understanding, bird conservation requires individual specifications for each species. Further studies of tourism stress on bird species will reveal insights as how to improve conservation practices for the class Aves as a whole. Lastly, over the course of this review, a predominant vertebrate bias was observed in the literature available on ecotourism. This limitation is dangerous as key ecosystem niches filled by invertebrates are overlooked in conservation plans. Future studies should focus their effects on ecotourism on invertebrates in order to avoid future ecosystem collapses. Now, I just want to give you one last take-home message, and that is, bird watching causes increased corticosteroid concentration, and birds respond by changing their behavioral and functional and bodily functions. But long-term effects and diverse species requirements remain unknown. Therefore, future research requirements require more study of birds to identify genus and family-wide trends in order to produce better bird conservation plans in the future. Thank you.